Good morning, everybody. How are you?
My sound on? My sound is on.
Yeah, your sound is on. You're coming through perfectly. So,
Live from the Netherlands, yeah.
live from the Netherlands. It's hard to know how many people will come along at this time of year.
There's so much going on, eh? I mean, I just came out. I'm in the middle of another conference, so.
Oh, are you?
Yeah.
Oh well, hopefully some more people will join once we've made a start. But it'll still be valuable to record the session and record the content and make that accessible. So with your permission, I'll make a start. We do have two great speakers this morning. This is the 8th Design Matters seminar, which is part of the Cost Action 18236. Catchy.
Really?
Multi-Disciplinary Innovation for Social Change. So our two speakers this morning are both from Northumbria University, and Reem Talhouk is going to speak broadly about design for humanitarian and international development, and Spaa is going to speak broadly about design for policy. And I'm very much looking forward to both of their talks and welcoming them to this seminar and allowing them to introduce themselves in a much better fashion than I've done. Reem's going to be our first speaker. She'll speak for about 30 minutes or so, and then we'll have the opportunity to have a short discussion. Then I'll invite Anna in, and Anna will again have about 30 minutes. So without further ado, please, Reem, you take control and guide us through your content.
Thank you, Nick. Let me just share my screen, and fingers crossed Teams is cooperative.
It's called Teams, so it should be, but
I don't think it was really designed for collaborative teams. It's a very productivity teams definition. Right. So you should be able to see my screen.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thanks, Reem.
Brilliant. So thank you, Nick, for inviting me to today's seminar. So as Nick said, I am at Northumbria University. I'm a research fellow, and my work sits in between design, human-computer interaction, and international development. Before we delve into how my research integrated experience-centered design into a humanitarian community resilience framework, I would like to give a brief overview of the context in which the research was conducted. So the research was conducted in Lebanon, where I am from. It is a small Middle Eastern country on the Mediterranean that borders with Palestine and Syria. The country currently has the largest density of refugees per square meter, hosting Palestinian, Syrian, and Iraqi refugees. And refugees in Lebanon experience daily challenges, including challenges in accessing healthcare, securing livelihoods, safe housing, discrimination, and food security. And these challenges can be attributed to the deteriorating economic situation in Lebanon, historical conflict within the country and with neighboring countries, and international and national migration policies. In 2010, we witnessed one of the biggest shakeups within the humanitarian system. With a decrease in funding and increase in displacement, humanitarian organizations signed off of two key changes. The first being the humanitarian development nexus, which has been termed as the grand bargain, which entails a concerted effort for humanitarian and international development organizations to start working together rather than in their silos. The second was the turn to innovation, both within organizations and within the delivery of aid and international development. 2013 marked one of the first reports on how technologies are being used within humanitarian contexts and the potential for further leveraging them. We also witnessed the establishment of innovation labs in humanitarian organizations that eventually transitioned into humanitarian services. And a study of that transition can be a study on its own, a presentation and study on its own. However, what is important to note is that these organizations turn to Silicon Valley expertise to guide them and train them in design and innovation, thus embedding design thinking as the primary approach to innovation. Also during that time, the concept of community resilience emerged into prominence as part of the grand bargain. Community resilience is the notion that marginalized communities and individuals should be able to adapt, withstand, and bounce back from shocks and stressors. It is within these contexts of displacement and conceptual knowledge that I transitioned from studying and researching public health to design in 2015. But both community resilience and digital humanitarianism, which was referred to the technical innovation within that space, had critiques and concerns. While humanitarian organizations saw hope in community resilience as an empowering conceptual tool that, when implemented, would enable communities to take ownership of their recovery, scholars such as Duffield and Evans and Reed pointed out that in doing so, what we're doing is shifting the responsibilities to responding to crises from governments and the international community to already vulnerabilized and marginalized communities. And that by saying that these communities should be resilient, we are contributing to a dystopian narrative in which communities should always be working to prepare for future crises and survival, rather than working towards challenging the structures that marginalize them and working towards futures in which they can flourish and reach their aspirations. These critiques have been recently acknowledged by the UN in their COVID-19 recovery research roadmap, where now the focus is on resilience as transformational change. And the critiques were also similar when people were looking into digital humanitarianism. So scholars pointed out that digitalizing aid contributes to distancing marginalized communities from the aid system, as their interactions would now be mediated through technologies. And they questioned how digital innovation would address the socio-political and economic factors that marginalize communities. Additionally, scholars such as Jacobson highlighted that humanitarians claim that technologies are apolitical and therefore neutral, are inherently flawed. And therefore, we need to consider the social, political, and economic factors that go into the design, deployment, and situation of humanitarian technologies. It is while holding both the potentials of humanitarian technologies and critiques in my mind that I want to explore how design can strengthen that middle ground and enable us to create technological innovations for community resilience that account for and counter existing, and in my mind, rightful critiques. So before delving into the frameworks and the design methodology and how it was implemented, let me give you an overview of what we ended up with. So I worked with a refugee community in Lebanon, a Syrian refugee community in Lebanon that was living in an informal settlement. And we looked specifically at the challenge of food insecurity. And what they currently had, the system that they currently had, was a digital aid system where refugees were each given, each household was given a debit card that was topped up every month by the World Food Program. And they could use this debit card to buy only food and only in shops that were registered with the program. And when we examined this technology, what we found is that the technology contributed to power asymmetries simply through how it was situated in some towns only in one shop that was in vicinity of the settlement, and that the participants felt that it was affordable to travel to. But also because the system was designed to enable only refugees only buying food, they would engage in workarounds with the shop owner to say, I want to buy a shampoo with my food voucher, with my e-voucher. And the shop owner would say, yeah, okay, but I'm going to increase the price of this shampoo because I'm taking a risk onto myself. And then they would the shop owner would scan in food until it reached the price of that shampoo. And when participants were talking about, well, his prices are high, but we can't challenge them because we're reliant on him for this workaround. And so what we saw is that there's a lack of ability to negotiate because of the systems design and where the technology is situated, but also within the design of the technology in itself and what the technology is designed to secure. It's designed to secure that the food aid being donated by funders is only used for food. And also, some of the things that participants engaged with and emphasized is that they place a high value on collective practices and the communal. And the intricacies of the communal is something that we'll talk about in terms of sub-communities within a community. But what they would said is that when they do have cash available to them, they go and buy in bulk, they pool their money, go and buy in bulk, benefit from discounts, and then divide up those items amongst themselves. But again, the e-voucher system does not enable that because it is designed for household level, where the shop owner is required to verify that this is the person who is entitled to aid, and also is advised not to sell in quantities that is not reflective of what a household would typically need. Because what if that refugee is buying in bulk, benefiting from discounts, and then selling them in the market at market price or higher? So I used food insecurity as the case study. And what we did is that we designed a blockchain-based system that wasn't fully realized. We reached the mock-up stage that actually was configured and designed for collective action and collective practices. The reason it was blockchain-based is because the World Food Program was already piloting in Jordan blockchain-based technology that mimicked the e-voucher system in terms of interactions that it mediated. So only the back end was changing. And so by engaging in experience-centered design, we were able to embed participants' communal values that they viewed integral to their community resilience as they envisioned their resilience. And it aimed to counter power asymmetries and the individualized and household way of being currently enforced by the digital food aid technologies in use. And these speak to countering the critiques of community resilience because they are addressing the socio and political factors by configuring refugees and placing them in places of agency where they're able to negotiate with the aid system, with the shop owner, and challenge the discriminations that they were facing, and also challenge the notion that they are just beneficiaries of aid and on the receiving end of aid. So how did it happen? So first I went about selecting a community resilience framework, and you can see my very poorly visualized, but yet visualized visualization of the framework that I ended up using. And I scoped multiple frameworks and ranked them based on how they define a community, how they defined community resilience, the inclusivity of the framework's approach, and how they engage with the notion of accountability. And these criteria were selected based on the critiques of community resilience. And so I ended up with working with the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent's community resilience framework that has a nuanced definition of community, that highlights that community resilience should address root causes of vulnerability and also maintain strong notions of connectedness and accountability of the state and the aid organizations. It also recommends a people-centered approach that advocates with communities, engages with communities, and works within the formal and informal systems of aid. However, the framework does not provide a nuanced definition or process for a people-centered approach. So I turned to exploring the multiple different design approaches available in our field. After careful consideration on how they aligned in principle to resilience and engaging in reflexive practice in which I analyzed my previous design work with refugees, I opted for an experience-centered design approach, which was developed by Wright and McCarthy. This approach draws on Dewey's definition of experience, which is the process by which we as humans make sense of our actions in relation to our emotions, will, and imagination. Within that definition, we view experiences as continuously transforming based on past, current, and envisioned future experiences. They are shaped by place and people and the values and beliefs of actions of people. Additionally, experiences are viewed as interplays between emotions and actions. In ECD's application within human-computer interaction, it aims to investigate how experiences are enriched and influenced by relationships with people as well as technology, and vice versa. It produces a breakaway from a consumerist approach to technology design, as through designing with and for experiences, we would be accounting for the sociopolitical structures that shape them. And we would be able to embed people's values into technologies, as it is these values that shape their envisioned future experiences. So just briefly going over some of the cornerstones of ECD that informed my work. Firstly, there's dialogue. And dialogue is the way in which new meanings and shared understandings among participants and between the participants and the researcher and designer are co-constructed. Dialogue also extends to empathy, in which empathy is not viewed as placing yourself in participants' shoes, but rather attentively listening to their experiences, values, and beliefs, and placing them in dialogue with your experiences and your values and beliefs. And then you take that and feed it back into the design process, and also into your understanding of participants and what we're doing together. And this dialogical process is part of co-constructing shared understandings. And as such, the dialogical process is a process in which we can empathetically respond to participants and also work with the multiple voices within that dialogue. And I ended up working with it because of one of the key things is that by accounting for past, current, and future experiences, we're also accounting for the disruptive nature that becoming forcibly displaced has on our experiences, and then in turn on our values and beliefs. I then augmented the design approach with research on researching in humanitarian contexts. So understanding the role of non-governmental organizations within my research process, what it means to have safe spaces for participants, what it means for researcher safety and identity, and having to be flexible within a very volatile context and situation. And also what is considered as meaningful outcomes in doing research in humanitarian contexts, but also what it means to have a meaningful role as a researcher within that community. So what did all of this translate into? First, so the research was conducted over 2 years, where I would go to the settlement almost every day of the week over periods of 3 months, and then 3 months analysis and 3 months going in. And initially when I went and started talking with potential participants in that settlement, I just went in with a variety of different methods and tools. So I went in with cards that I had created, diaries, information about interviews and focus groups. And the idea was to actually work with participants in designing the design process. And in that way, getting a shared understanding of how we will be working together and also what tools that they would want to employ. And it was interesting because we had some participants who chose to use diaries with dialogue cards that I will describe next, and others that said, no, we'll only use the dialogue cards. So you can already see that then we had multiple sources of data coming into the process. But also, part of those initial engagement was starting to co-construct a shared understanding of the research and what it means to participate and participation. And this is where we had some participants say, I would love to participate with a group, and this is the group I want to participate with. And others saying, I want to participate with this other group, but we live near each other, we're respectful, but we don't socialize that much. And some participants that were said that I want to participate individually. And this is reflective of some of the community tensions that were already there, And this is something that I then accounted for in the design process, in that I had 2 groups that I was working with using group activities, and then 2 individuals that I was working with using individual activities. So in the group activities and the individual activities, what we did is we used dialogue cards. And these cards, I made them based on what is usually the constructs of food insecurity and is used in assessing food insecurity. So things like types of food, resources for cooking, and maintaining healthy food, like refrigerators. And then I brought in also the element of community resilience by making cards that represented different actors and individuals, so neighbors, mother-in-law, father-in-law, shop owner, aid worker. And participants also made their own cards as we went through the process. And the idea was that one participant would start a narrative of their experience of food insecurity and place cards together to show that narrative in relation to the different constructs of food insecurity and resilience. And then other participants would add cards, remove cards, and adapt that narrative to also reflect their individual experiences. And then we had targeted activities to use those cards to build more collective narratives. So what do we experience? What do you experience as a community? And so again, here we start seeing the multi-voicedness element of it, but also the process co-constructing this shared understanding of their experiences. And I was also able to use the cards as well to share some of my experiences and the experiences of my family, my parents and my grandparents during the Lebanese Civil War and my parents' migration, economic migration. And so the cards became a tool for participants and I to also create a shared understanding of each other as human beings and individuals within the design process. Given the multiple perspectives and the different data sources and the different groups and individuals participating, to bring them back into dialogue with one another rather than being other silos created, I did a preliminary analysis of the data and presented it back to participants in the form of quotes that were grouped thematically. And also data from the diaries were integrated in. And participants would then adapted and commented and added onto this presentation, which was a cardboard, basically. And again, engaged in further dialogue with their own data and the data of others. And after that, that data was incorporated into vignettes that furthered the design process. So the vignettes presented scenarios that would start off with one participant's experience and then bring in the other participants' experiences, followed by questions of, well, how would we want to leverage collective action and communal practices? What is the communal that we'll be working with? And how do we define it? And we explored different ideas. And the one that they all agreed upon was that let's explore collective purchasing as a way forward. And so based on the data generated through engaging with the vignettes, I was able to mock up a study using paper mock-ups that had dialogical interactions embedded in them. So for example, participants said, well, why would we want to, on our phones, agree on what we're all going to collectively purchase? We can just meet over coffee and do that and input it later as a group rather than individually. And so the process in itself was dialogical, and the mock-up study embedded these shared understandings of communal values, but also community tensions. So who can the collective expand to? How would 2 collectives functioning within the same settlement engage with one another? Where would they actually collaborate and work together? Where will they not? And what are the parameters that define those things? And also the mock-up study enabled us to be in dialogue with other stakeholders. So for example, if you look at the picture where there's that red box, which is people, these were actually offers that were made by shop owners I would go to shop owners, see what's available on bulk discount, and also say, let's forget about the e-voucher system. If I told you that there are 15 refugee households who want to purchase from you collectively, what discounts would you give them? And they would do that. And then I would take them and bring them into the study, and then participants would engage with them and then negotiate back and say, well, actually, this offer could be made better. And I'd then communicate that to the shop owner and come back. And so what it created is this space for participants to actually engage in collective action. And we did have participants in the end start coordinating, going to shops together and saying, right, Reem will buy a big bag of rice on discount, and and kind of to reciprocate that, someone else will buy the shampoo. We'll buy them on our separate e-vouchers, but then we'll do the exchange that adds up, and also going together for those discounts, and doing some of the basic economics of actually, if this shop has all these discounts already on offer, then we can collectively pool money for transportation and go. And so it was bringing information for the community that they can make use of. So then where did the element of responding to participants come out? Well, the design process in itself was responsive to how they envisioned doing design together and working together, and the tools that they are comfortable using, but also excited to use. Also, in our initial engagements, participants, I talked to participants quite honestly saying that the benefit of this research will probably not come out in the next 2 years. We will not be able to, if we don't secure funding or manage to meet with the World Food Program, we won't get that type of benefit immediately. What type of meaningful outcomes would you want from the process? And what they said is that they wanted a booklet that reflected their experiences, that gave advice to other refugees based on their experiences, but also a booklet that when an NGO worker comes in to do the food security questionnaire, they can show them that booklet and say, this is our experiences and how we view it. And they felt that this was not captured in the questions that were being asked in the questionnaires. They also asked for that booklet to be made online so that they can share it on Facebook, WhatsApp, Telegram, and so on, to advocate for their experiences. And one of the key things that the booklet ended on is that we want people to know that we are not ignorant and that these are the experiences. And they titled the book the struggles of Syrian refugees, despite the austerity and hardships we are living. And again, here we see that definition of resilience coming in to that, and that they wanted to make sure that their experiences show those struggles and the different factors that contribute to the challenges that they face, but also have that agency to show how they are navigating that. They also highlighted that a meaningful outcome and a meaningful role for me is to tutor the children in the settlement, because I speak English and Arabic, and so I can help them with their studies. And that was something that I thought was actually, yeah, that's fair enough. You're helping me with my studies, so why wouldn't I help you with your children's studies? And what we did is to make sure that it's not coercive. The tutoring happened for all the children in the settlement, whether their parents participated in the study or not. And the mock-up study was responsive, again, because it was actually engaging with the data from shops, and the participants were able to actually use that information to take action. The design process enabled that responsiveness. So if we go back to the community resilience framework I was working with, what we see is that by having an experience-centered design approach, we were able to do a concurrent exploration of the multiple elements of the framework. So what is a community? What is a resilient community? And how can we assist communities? I augmented it in that it is not engaging with communities, but rather understanding and working with communities at the center. And it enabled us to understand community tensions and design within the tensions between the formal and informal aid system. So the formalized technologies and the informal workarounds and bargaining that they wanted to engage with. We also the process did not only advocate for refugees and communities, but it co-designed community artifacts that they can use to advocate for themselves. And this was all based on a co-constructed shared understanding in that there's an element of agency that needs to be leveraged and an element of reconfiguring how refugees are forcibly configured into interactions with other actors. So then, if we revisit the critiques of community resilience, we can see how through employing ECD, we were able to counter them, not only in the resultant technological design that aimed to increase refugee agency within the aid system, thus making them more proximal to other actors, and by challenging the status quo that configured them as beneficiaries of aid, rather than active agents negotiating their food aid. It also embedded communal values and values of collective action, which arguably are conducive for further challenging the status quo and by working towards their aspirations. So by engaging in ECD, the design space accounted for the social and political and participants' values in a manner that did not shift the focus away from the problem of food insecurity, but rather raised the questions on how interactions mediated by technology that addresses food insecurity can also leverage collective practices and ways of being that participants wanted to leverage. How the interactions mediated by technology can increase refugee agency in their everyday interactions with other stakeholders so that they are challenging the status quo. And so the next step is to question, are design approaches employed by humanitarian organizations raising the same questions? How does it compare to questions raised by local designers and innovators that work outside of the aid system? And for me personally, how can we really push this research further to explore and incorporate decolonial design as a means of challenging the status quo within the aid system? Thank you very much.
That was absolutely wonderful. Thank you very much, Reem. Brilliant. If anybody does have a question or anything that they'd like to find out more about, please just kind of raise a hand or put a question in the chat. Peter's going to kick us off. Great. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this brilliant presentation. I really had to wrap my head around it because it's so different to what I'm doing. Because I'm focused on designing using macro studies. I think it's amazing. Well, my connection is a bit slow. But I was wondering, I mean, so you talk a lot about technology and the power of technology and, decolonialize and things like that. Do you think it's possible to develop, like, I don't know, some kind of cooperative type of technology which is putting the agency back into the group instead of the individual? I mean, like a communal debit card type of thing. Did you look into that?
So that is something definitely that is an avenue to explore. But I think one of the key things to kind of think about is how cooperatives in European contexts and Western contexts, which is where a lot of the dominant literature on cooperatives come out from, how would they differ in contexts that, one, you are not a citizen of a state, and where local politicians, shop owners will not even step into the space where you exist and live. And then let's take that a step further, and that what would a decolonial cooperative look like? And what are the different values that would go into a decolonial cooperative that is different? And this is where the technology isn't the solution. It is the medium through which we embed values leverage values, but also, for a way for communities to enforce back onto the system how they want to exist within the system and how they want to be within the system.
Very good. So I never thought about it in that way, but you're absolutely right. Okay, I need a moment for reflection. Maybe I'll have another question.
Great. Well, I'll pick up there because there's something really fascinating that I've been thinking about in other project contexts, but was quite clear for me coming through in the work that you've just described. And it was this interface and interaction between formal and informal systems, and also I guess something around the visibility and invisibility of those systems and their interactions. What was lovely in the project you've just described is you very clearly articulated how your research was interacting between those two systems. And I guess I had a question or just some interest around, whether you are, I don't know, whether in this form of work you feel that actually embedding and engaging authentically with those informal systems and consciously trying to become more visible and attuned to those systems is a kind of a cornerstone of the work. And that's the first part of the question, I guess. And the other one is around this. You used, I think, the word forcible configurations, which I thought was really interesting. So you've got this kind of formal systems of aid, which probably further enforce configurations, and then informal systems of care and economics and all sorts, and actually how you're leveraging through innovation work, through the design research, greater agency for collective and individual agency and action within that system. I don't know, could you speak a little bit more about that aspect?
Yeah. In terms of visibility and invisibility, it was what we need to acknowledge is that the informal system, while it does harm and vulnerabilize refugees, is also something that they are heavily reliant on. So the workarounds are something that they're heavily reliant on. And so the idea is to make visible the harm, but in a manner that also doesn't lead to more crackdown, if that makes sense. And we do that by making visible how whether consciously or unconsciously, the system was designed to uphold the values of the aid system and the funders and what they wanted to secure over that of refugees. And that is what we need to make visible. And that the technology, it's not that the technology didn't work and that's why they were vulnerable. It was because it was designed to work in a way that was not, that did not account for practices and experiences. So that is one thing. And then in response to the formal and informal, and this is a big question in that, and also linking to kind of the colonial design, which I'm starting to explore, is that can we do decolonial design within a system that is inherently a colonial system? And there's a lot of decolonial thinkers that talk about using the tools of our masters against our masters, and others that say, actually, it all needs to go. And so when I was talking to a colleague of mine that used to head MSF's innovation group, she said, it needs to stop being a big system, but rather a decentralized system that is actually engaging with the informal, but not co-opting the informal. And that is hopefully something that I've applied for funding, fingers crossed, that I aim to explore by actually bringing in those different actors around the same table and explore the tensions within that and how we might do that. And it might be that the system needs to be redesigned. That is the thing. And until we do that, we need to find those pockets of agency that we can further leverage to kind of make sure that we're not actually eroding individuals' abilities and capabilities to exist the way that they want to exist.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Does anybody have a final question before I thank Reem and we move on to Anna? Okay, in that case, thank you very much for your fascinating and inspirational talk. Thank you very much, Reem. Anna, would you like to take over control and share your content with us?
Yes. I was going through my slides and realized that I still have one template image. So I'll just remove that one. So if there's one image, a slide that doesn't have an image, you know why.
It's okay. We forgive you already.
Thanks. Before I start, a simple joke. Yes. So yes, I'm Anna. I'm a Dutch PhD student, who just submitted her thesis last Monday, so I'm still in a recovering phase. But I've looked at policy practices in the UK. So it's worth mentioning that I'm Dutch, so I'm not a UK citizen, and I don't have the right to vote, etc. So I was an outsider to any policy processes that I studied. Second of all, I'm a designer. Can you see my screen? Yes, okay. I'm a designer, secondly. That was my professional training. There we go. And so I'm also not a policymaker. And from those two different positions, I wanted to research how policy and design can help each other. There is a discourse, an academic discourse called Design for Policy, and I sort of fall within that discussion. But what I tried to do was to sort of highlight how there are two discussions going on in that discourse. One that is very much design-centered, taking a design perspective, looking at policy, and the other one being very policy-centered, looking from a policy perspective to the potential of design methods. So just to give a sense of my understanding, I'll just leave it like this because it keeps going back and forth. My understanding of a policy process in very, very simple terms is that there's a reason for a policy to be developed. There's a public problem or a public opportunity that government thinks they need to respond to. Then after that's the policy team tends to become part of the process in defining the problem and scoping the challenge. This is continuously throughout the process. There is an interaction between politicians and policy teams. So there is an apolitical and a political strand of work going on at the same time, which of course leads to a number of complexities. So once there's been a phase of defining the problem and scoping what the challenge is for a policy team to address and inform politicians on, a policy team moves into a phase of policy formulation, which means they draw up opportunities, they research the impact of potential policy ideas on predominantly the impact on government. So does it work within relation to other policies? Does it work in relation to the general mindset of that government, etc., etc.? What are the costs of it, very simply put? And after that, what I found was that policy teams focus very much on getting their processes approved and their ideas approved. So there's a lot of decision making. So while I've put in this simple overview policy formulation and decision making as sequential, there's a lot of iterations going on in that phase. And once a policy is approved and there is an idea of how to respond to this public problem or public opportunity, that's when things move into implementation. But as I said, do you see the screen moving back and forth as well?
No.
No, okay, so it's just me that sees weird things going on. As I said, my understanding is how I put it in the slide is very, very simple. This is a more representative image of the process. This was created by UK Policy Lab. It's a public sector innovation lab based at UK government, and they explore the use of design methods for a policy context. And what they did as a side project was to map what a policy process is, or a policy making process. So there's a lot of stuff going on. There's many different factors involved, different people. You can spot that there's the citizen on the right hand side, there's the governmental minister. At the bottom you see maybe the logo of Policy Lab. So there's a lot of networking going on in this complex infrastructure. Just to give you this more complex overview of my simple understanding and way to describe the policy process. So I'm a designer, as I said, and my interest is to get an understanding of how design could contribute to policy making practices. The unit I mentioned before, UK Policy Lab, focuses predominantly on defining the problem and scoping the challenge. This is done because there's the understanding that a lot of the mistakes that are made in policy design processes are made during this initial state of setting the challenge, of defining what needs to be designed. So that's my understanding of why Policy Lab decides to focus predominantly on this first stage where the policy team becomes involved. What I found interesting, though, was that it wasn't clear to me, based on the literature, what happens with these design methods and the contributions that these design methods make in the later stages of a policy design process. So what happens to these policy methods, to these design methods when the policy process moves into policy formulation and decision making? And are there ways for designers to contribute and to continue their support to policymakers in these later phases? So I conducted 3 studies throughout my PhD, and reflecting back on them as I was writing my thesis, I found that a very, very important part of policymaking is to bring together the different perspectives to understand the complexity of a problem, not only from the idea of the problem itself, being that a problem can have environmental impact, can have social impact, can have political impact, but also those who are addressing the problem, that they bring in their perspectives. And so what appears to be one of the main challenges of a policy team is their ability to bring these perspectives together. And what do I mean with a perspective is the idea that in order for me to understand a problem, I need to understand what influences my perspective, and my perspective then influences again how I understand that problem. So a perspective can be based on previous experiences, on morals and values that I believe in. They can be informed by the constraints that I work under. So knowing the system that my solution needs to exist in, are there constraints that limit the opportunities that I have for responding to this problem? And as I said, one of the biggest challenges of a policy team is to bring these different perspectives together, because a politician can have a different perspective from someone who works for the Department of Economics and someone else who works for the Department of Education. So what I saw in reflecting on the 3 studies, what I saw was that designers appeared to support policymakers in making these different perspectives visible. it took a long time before I realized this, because it was one of the implicit contributions that designers made to the policy design process. Because we talk about design in certain ways, but what design actually means is quite unclear. So I can understand if it's still unclear to you what design means in policy, but that's because it was also unclear to me at this point in my research. But what I did come to understand was that at some point, I did this to give a bit of a background information about the different studies that I did. In the second study, I worked with UK Policy Lab. So I did a participant observation. I joined the team for 2 months as a policy designer, just working along with them, having chats with the people that work in that team to get a sense of how they use their methods, what kinds of methods they develop. And I saw that they did a lot of co-creation workshops. They did something called speculative design, which I'll come back to later, and that they provided a lot of training for civil servants. In the third study, I worked with policymakers to see how, after they've collaborated with Policy Lab, how they continued or not continued to use the design methods, and see why this was the case, and how at the same time they were developing the idea for policy further. And what I found comparing these two studies was that what the designers had introduced policymakers to was to be able to highlight different perspectives through reflection. And what reflection means in a design context is 3 things. And those 3 things I saw happening in Policy Lab. So this is the slide without a picture. I was looking for a shot of a still of a video that showed work that was done by UK Policy Lab in the railway infrastructure, and how if you want to put a buggy in the train, it's really hard because there's no step, there's no ramp, you just have to lift it up. And so that's a daily experience of people that are making use of the railway infrastructure. So what that picture visualized was the use of design to the use of designers of ethnographic methods to make clear a human-centered perspective on a policy process. So what this means is that in an ethnography, the designers would follow those who were impacted by policy in their daily lives, and in their daily lives, how they would interact with their certain policies. How would they be supported by these policies, or also how could these policies be detrimental to their everyday experience? A second way that designers support and elicit reflection in order to bring up the different perspectives that exist in a policy team and in a policy problem is by running workshops. There's a lot of co-creation workshops going on at Policy Lab, which aren't focused on finding a solution, but instead on making the different perspectives by the participants clear. So to give an example, there is a method they call hopes and fears, which is a stack of pictures that during which participants are asked to give short descriptions of what their hopes and their fears for the policy challenge are, and link their reflections to these particular images. So it could be a sunny sky, and based on that picture, they think about something in relation to the policy project that is by their perspective, and then by then making clear what their hopes and their fears are, gives an idea to the other participants where this individual is coming from and how they understand the problem. But it's important to emphasize here again is that these workshops aren't focused on providing a solution or coming to a solution. They are purely to make clear the complexity of the different perspectives and to come together to identify what the shared challenge is. A third type of design that is used in a policy context is the design of boundary objects. So this is a lot, it's a much more recent development. There's not much work done on this yet, but it uses speculative design, which means that it uses design to create artifacts that can show how things could be in the future. And in the context of policy, that means that it could design artifacts around fictional policies that might exist in the future. So this example shows a picture of flags, which were designed as part of a project on the use of autonomous vessels and the impact of these autonomous vessels on the maritime infrastructure policy. So if we start having vessels that are unmanned, how do these communicate to the other manned vessels out on sea? What Policy Lab did was they designed a set of fictional flags that could inform other vessels about the status of this autonomous unmanned vessel out on sea. These flags, of course, aren't solutions to a problem or a policy opportunity, because this policy doesn't exist. The policy itself has not been designed yet, but this is a fictional solution to a fictional policy. So again, they're not solutions, but these ideas intend to provoke discussion amongst the participants, amongst the stakeholders that are relevant to the design of policy, and to see how these different participants understand these ideas from a different perspective. And by bringing these objects into the shared space with multiple different perspectives in that same room, you can have a more in-depth discussion about what the problem is, what the opportunity is, and how you could overcome that, while using the different perspectives as an asset rather than a problem to the process. So the three examples that I mentioned of how design helps in the context of policy, you can see a lot of colorful, playful materials. These are creative, they have the design mindset, they have the design thinking mindset, all the things that design promotes and advocates for and gives a lot of attention to. But the reality of policy is forms. Form filling, writing reports, using words more than anything else, because words are easy to monitor. These explorative, creative means, like the flyers that you can see on this picture, they are visual. The flags are visual. They're the opposite of the verbal main material of design of policymakers. So what's next? And I think this relates to what Reem was saying about colonialism and how the use the tools of the master against their master's will. And I think what design for policy has often argued for is to get rid of all forms of bureaucracy, getting rid of form filling, of getting rid of vertical hierarchies to make sure that everything can happen co-creatively. But these forms of bureaucracy do enable government to operate at the scale that it does. It allows thousands of people to work according to a similar framework and to get things done. And yes, it might not be the most efficient, and yes, it might not be the most creative, and it might not allow for the most explorative ways of going through the process, but they do give structure to a very, very complex system, a complex organization, and a complex goal. So my argument I argue, informed by my studies, that we can look into how we can use these bureaucracies to our advantage, and how can we as designers contribute to policymaking by becoming embedded in bureaucracy. And in simple words, and in simple terms, what I mean to say is that how can we make these forms in such a way that they can elicit reflective practice? So how can we make sure that we highlight the different perspectives that people bring into their policy process? And how can we highlight those through the use of reflection? And I'm aware I'm 10 minutes short, but that's actually all I wanted to say.
Well, that's fantastic, Arne, and you don't need to say any more than you want to say. That's perfect. Super, thank you. Before I ask a question, is there anybody else that would like to go first? Anything burning for people?
Well, yeah.
Someone is sharing a screen, but I don't think that's me. Euro College abstracts.
Okay, that's gone.
No, thank you so much. And I was basically going to ask the same question as you came into in the final slide. Like, what's the relationship between, well, the creative process and also the policymakers? So also, for example, with UK Policy Lab, which I think sounds amazing, and also especially for our working group on cost, I might come back to you if you don't mind.
Yeah,
but, great. So, but how are they related? I mean, does the government listen to them? Do they implement things from them, or is it more like, oh, those geeks over there, they can sit and they can talk forever, and we just go on with our basically black and white policy document? So what's the relationship between the two?
I think all of the above. That's what makes it such a complex thing, because there is especially in the UK government, there is a definite interest in using design methods and design thinking methods to see how they could improve their policy making practices. Mm-hmm. That interest has led them to establish this UK Policy Lab. But then looking at the organizational structure of a UK Policy Lab, you can see that they actually sit outside the conventional practice. That means that they don't work with the same constraints as most of the policy process they don't work with the same constraints that the policy process is subject to. So they don't, it's less about what is the constraint of money, it's less about how it influences other policies, and it's less about how can this actually be accomplished within the means of government. But then, again, on the other side of the other perspective is that all of the work that Policy Lab does is commissioned by government departments. So their funding model is heavily reliant on the work that government provides them with. It's policy teams that reach out to Policy Lab to use these designerly methods. So it's as I said, all of the above. It's part of the of the organization, and it's not at the same time. And so I think that's also where my interest came from, to see how these policy teams that do work with Policy Lab, how they continue to use these design methods. And they don't use design methods in the designerly form. But what they did do, and I didn't spend much time on that in the presentation, but what several of the participants, the policymakers, mentioned was that they stopped and reflected on their process. They stopped and they looked back at what their initial idea was. They looked at the document that they had as a result of their collaboration with Policy Lab. And they looked at, for example, the categories that they had created about the target group, the assumptions that were about made about the target group of the policy. And so there was a very informal, implicit way of continuing the use of designerly thinking in the process, but it wasn't embedded in their official process, so to say, in any way. It didn't come back in the forms, etc. So there is a clear tension, but I think there's a very pragmatic thing that we can do from here, and it's to look into those forms and just see how we can change the kind of questions that are asked on this form to facilitate that continuation of reflection.
Thank you. And I was also wondering, also in relationship to my own work, because if you look at those, I mean, you said, well, documents are there to control and to monitor things like that, and it makes sense. I mean, you need to have something. But did you encounter anything beyond that? Because I'm reading a lot about projectification at the moment. Everything is on outputs and steering, monitoring, evaluation, etc. But I sometimes feel there must be more, because everything is a project now. You're depending on funding. You need to do this. You need to deliver that. And if you deliver it, okay, next project. But did you encounter any new ideas around that that we maybe have to go beyond that? That we, I don't know, give people like a mission. Hey, in 30 years, we want to go with that. Hey, please do whatever you can. Is there something going on? Because I think the UK is always way ahead of the rest of Europe with stuff like this.
Yeah, well, there's definitely that, because some of the new thinking that's going on in UK Policy Lab, and I'm in no way affiliated to them, so this is me as an outsider looking at what they do. So you can't. I'm just a messenger, which is informal and more of a gossipy person than an actual informal. But there's a lot of thought about this idea of systems level thinking, and that designers. It's to do with the approach to complexity.
Yeah, exactly.
So I looked at the complexity that's brought in by those working on the problem, but there's also still the complexity that comes from the actual problem itself and the nested nature of problems. Yeah. And what they are saying is that, well, we need to find ways of articulating these complexities that exist across different domains, that exist across different layers of government. And simply put, how do we think in the system? And there are, as far as I'm aware, there aren't really clear strands of work going on here, but there's a lot of strategy development. And I think technology is a really good thing to look at in this case, and how technology is influencing and disrupting a lot of existing policy. So that was the example of the flags, sort of looking at the disruption of autonomous technologies, AI, etc. How they will disrupt a whole set of policies, and how do you respond to challenges like that? But responding with some flags, which are really valuable, but it's not going to be like the thing that makes everything simple. No. I think you made another point very much in the beginning, that that forms will structure a process, but there must be more. And I think most of it actually happens outside the form. I think the form is the main way for the different layers of government to communicate to each other. It's to inform about progress, and it's to sign things off. But a lot of the practice happens in these meetings, happens in the knowledge of the industry and government, like the networks that exist between them. There's a lot of informal progress made that you will not see reflected in the forms, and maybe that's something that these forms should integrate, because it is of a more reflective nature, those informal conversations. But yeah, I don't know if they actually allow for that in these forms. But forms, I think, it's like the end of year report that you get in school. It doesn't represent your learning, but it does help you to get through to the next year.
That's really interesting. One of the things that you said in the talk, Anna, was about the role of design practices and policy lab in terms of better understanding the problem or the opportunity, and kind of nuancing, I guess, and understanding around that from multiple perspectives. Is there any sense of, or, you know, do you have any insights about how that understanding carries through a policy-making process, or actually is influenced again once the policymakers get their hands on it, they reinsert their own perspective as the dominant? I was just wondering how that understanding that's built by Policy Lab carries through the policy-making process.
Yeah, I think what it's important to mention here is that policymakers are bringing in their own perspective, but are predominantly led by the structures of government. So they describe themselves in that third study that I did very much as taking a generalist approach to come to advise the ministers. So what they do is to bring in those different perspectives, but then synthesize them as a, not objective, but as a but as a sort of synthesizing. I need to sort of find the right words for this. They do bring in the perspectives, but these are not acknowledged in the processes that they are supposed to go through. And so part of the reflective practice is to also allow for that agency of a policymaker to become clear. And this aligns with a big discussion in design, where a lot of designers state that they facilitate human-centered design. But what is human-centered design? Don't we bring any of our reflection in? But we do facilitate the methods. We do choose the challenge. We do choose to invite certain people. So there's a huge agency in us as designers in facilitating a supposedly neutral process. That's not answering your question. Can you quickly rephrase it?
No, well, I mean, actually, you are answering my question. I think your reflections are really interesting, and it's, you know, that term that Reem brought up earlier around forcible configurations, just kind of flashing up again for me as you were talking. You know, the designer's agency actually in structuring the process, selecting the participants, you know, or participants are self-selecting because of a whole range of other configurations. You know, all of that actually is kind of a perspective and political, and it isn't objective and neutral.
Yeah.
And, you know, and I think so, you know, all of that is within the kind of the understanding of the problem or the opportunity, and when handed over to policymakers who are also gathering different perspectives, they are also doing the same thing. But if that's not acknowledged and understood, then we have a huge hidden system within which all sorts of manipulations may take place that leads to a policy. I don't know. It was just...
So I think two things. What Policy Lab is able to do, so a lot of designers, or the designers working in Policy Lab, are able to sort of bypass the existing constraints, etc. It's much more of a free thinking space. They may have actually a stronger agency in the process than the policy team themselves, because what happens when policy teams continue after collaborating with Policy Lab is that they, at least what I found through the conversations that I had with policymakers, is that they then have to say, well, yes, this is great, but government can't do this because, and then they have the analysis from different departments coming in saying, well, actually, if you do this, then it will impact policy B in this way. And so it's a nice idea, but we can't do it. So their agency has a different form in a way, because it's not about saying, well, this is how we think about the problem, but it's about actually articulating, actually, we can't do so and so. It's a great idea, but how do we morph this into a form that does fit within government? Secondly, about the neutrality of actors in these processes, problem-solving processes, let's call them that, is the idea that we should either become a science or we become an art. But there's neither really exists, because you choose a topic because it interests you, and then you choose to go through a different lens and remove all of the other complexity to go into that specific notion. That's a scientific approach, but you've already made 2 agency decisions. And on the other side, art is very rigorous, but doesn't articulate in words, doesn't come up with recipes, because they understand that every situation is different. So what designers do is they sit in that middle, and what often is referred to as the design mindset, as an inexplainable or inexplicable phenomenon. What they do is sort of bringing those 2 practices together and looking at how we can take the best of both worlds. But then we do need to explain what that mindset is. And I think reflection is one of those aspects of what we otherwise would say we can't explain as designers. But it's actually just verbalizing and voicing our reflections during a process, which are very rational, but are explicitly mentioning our agency.
Fantastic.
Someone was there and disappeared, so I don't know if that person wanted to ask a question.
I don't see any hands up, but
You're muted.
Oh, yeah, you got your own back on me with.
Still muted.
Yeah, I couldn't unmute. Very strange. Does anybody else have a question?
I'm listening. I'm just okay. I'm just listening. Interesting things about the design and the policy, and how you connect the 2. So it's really interesting to see how it can be combined and achieve what you are trying with design, the policymakers. So that is a challenge by itself. So. It really interesting. I'm just listening, and it's great. It's great to have work, and especially from people that they, you just graduate with your doctorate, or?
Yeah, I still need to do my Viva. The hardest part is still to come.
Good. I'm glad that. We have this opportunity to see, because this is an example of what we can do in our institutions with students and other faculty members.
Excellent.
May I ask where you are based? Are you at a university, or?
I'm in Cyprus. It's a college, actually, but we're collaborating with universities and colleges as well in different projects. So. Yeah. What Nick is, we try to connect and to collaborate in the past, and hopefully in the future we'll manage, because it seems that time is, time.
Yeah, it's always time.
It's always the time. But it's really great to be part of this series and listen, and hopefully, I don't know, Nick, hopefully sometime we'll be able to get together.
Well, absolutely. I think we're all looking forward to being able to actually meet each other in person. As good as this kind of monthly meetup has been, it will be nice to be able to actually get round a table and maybe flesh out some ideas of what we might do together. Let me just formally bring this session to a close. Anna, that was absolutely wonderful. So thank you very much for sharing your research and your insights. The seminar next month will bring a speaker from the NHS, and interestingly, actually, this is somebody who is who's going to give some examples of how they've influenced the system and the techno system, the bureaucracy, to enable, I guess, better results for individual patients or people in need. So actually there's a lovely kind of build from your position of let's get designers engaging with bureaucracy to hear what Josh has been doing inside the NHS. So hopefully people will be able to join us for that meetup next month. I'm going to end the recording, but thank you all very much for attending.
Thank you too.
Bye.